actually finished chapter 5 last Sunday, this past Sunday, and we should be starting chapter 6 tonight. And if you're on with us on the, if I can find in my own book what page it is, in page 50, 4950 in our little workbook. All right, Paul on the third journey now has come to Ephesus. We're assuming he may have written it there. At least we're studying it now. We know he wrote 1 Corinthians, which will be our next study. We'll study that after we finish Acts 19. We'll go back to that. But Acts, for those of you visiting, Acts is our foundation. And we're using that, going through and putting Paul's letters in chronologically. And so we come to the book of Galatians. Now, Paul had visited those cities of southern Galatia on what journey? First journey. What were the cities? I know Janet knows. Antioch, Iconium,
Lystra, Derbe.
Good. Those are the four that we know he visited because it's mentioned in Luke, in Acts. And he could have mentioned some others, been to some others, but we know those. And there were problems. There were Jews mixed with Gentiles. There was Jewish jealousy at Antioch. We know Paul went from Antioch to Iconium. Jews from Antioch stirred up problems there. Went to Lystra, and they thought he was a god. He and Barnabas were gods because they did what? They healed the man who was lame, and they started offering sacrifices. And then it ended up Jews came and stirred up. They did what to Paul? Stoned him, left him for dead. And then he goes to Derbe. Then he retraces his steps. That's journey number one. Then he went through that area, but we don't know any of the details in the second journey. And then the third journey, we come and at some point, there's been a defection of the truth, toward the truth. I marvel you're so soon removed from him who called you in the grace of Christ to a different gospel. And the different gospel was they were taking the gospel and adding what to it? The law. And as well as what made you a Jew. Not made you a Jew, but it was circumcision. And so a lot of this is in answer to that. So his defense of his own apostolic office, then the heart of the letter, the relation of the law to the gospel, and now where we've been, practical applications. Now the point was, when Paul said, you're not under law but under grace, that might have led some people to think, well, we don't have any what at all? Law at all. And but the truth of the matter is, for a person to sin, he's got to be under law. Where there is no sin, there is no law. Romans 4.
Where there is no law, there is no sin.
That's right. Where there's no law, did I say just reverse? Where there's no sin, there's no law. Yeah. Where there's no law, there's no sin. And so because sin is a violation of divine law, 1 John 3 verse 4. So Paul talked about the idea that freedom in Christ is not to be perverted into a license to sin. We're just going to go through briefly. We went through the 5th chapter in some detail, studying the idea of flesh and the works of the flesh and the struggle between the flesh and the spirit. And then we studied the fruit of the Spirit. And come on down. Jonathan, we're just going to fast forward through all this. And then we ended chapter 5. Come on down. We ended chapter 5 Sunday morning by talking about how the fruit of the Spirit is actually an antidote to the problems, the works of the flesh. And then we gave a number. Paul said concerning the works of the flesh and such like, and we looked at a bunch of things that I think could go in right here. This is where we ended Sunday morning. What about such like? Anything that would be an application of these sexual sins, religious sins, social sins, and sins of excess or drunkenness sins. Anything that would be an application of those would be such like. And now we're in chapter 6. And we continue on with these practical applications. Keep in mind now, he's been talking in chapter 5 about the conflict between the flesh and the spirit. Notice in 5:16, walk by the Spirit and ye shall not do what? Fulfill the lust of the flesh. And they're contrary the one to the other. And in verse 18, but ye are led by the Spirit. You're not under the law. So we are to walk by the Spirit. And when we walk by the Spirit and we develop these spiritual qualities and we put to death these works of the flesh, when we do that, then we're led by the Spirit. And then if you'll look at the end of that chapter, in verse 25, if we live by the Spirit let us also walk. So we're led, we live, we walk by the Spirit. And we, as a result, should not become vainglorious. What do your translations have for vainglorious? Conceited, provoking one another, and envying one another. Don't do that. Don't do those things. Selfish ambition, vainglory, provoking, envying, all of those things. Well, even the word envy is one of the works of the flesh. But all of those things would lead people to do what? Good or wrong or bad? Yeah, bad. They're provoking people to what we might say is bring out the worst in them. You know, one of the qualifications of elders is that they're lovers of that which is good. I remember years ago reading H.E. Phillips' book on the eldership, and he made a point. He says you take a stone and you just rub it and polish it, and it becomes even more beautiful. He said that's kind of the idea behind this idea of lover of that which is good. It nourishes, it fosters the good. It brings out the best in people. And y'all know people like that, don't you? It brings out the best rather than the worst. And then you'll be around people at work or school, and it's like, you know, you got to keep your mind straight or it'll be in the gutter if you listen to much of what they say. And it's just, so that's the way we want to be, to try to help people to cultivate the very best in them. So, let's go on. In chapter 6, I mentioned here the couple of main ideas, but we'll break those down. You have positive responsibilities to each other. Brethren, even if a man be brethren, that's everybody, even if a man be overtaken in any trespass, ye who are spiritual, restore such a one. You've got brethren who sin, and ourselves, as well as teachers, all dealt with in those first 10 verses. And he deals with brethren who have fallen or been overtaken in a trespass. That's an interesting idea. Here is a person who's just been, when you overtake, like if you overtake a car, you're on the freeway and he's doing 50 and you're doing 70, and all of a sudden what happens? You overtake him, you go past him. And the idea behind that word, if I understand it correctly, is something that's come on somebody pretty suddenly. Brethren, even if a man be overtaken in any trespass, then you who are what? Spiritual, do what? Restore such a one in the spirit of meekness or gentleness, considering yourself, lest you also be tempted. All right, so we want to look at the first couple of verses deal with spiritual people, and contextually, somebody, well, what's a spiritual person? Contextually, it would be a person who's what? Is developing the fruit of the Spirit and is refraining from the works of the flesh. Who's that? Well, look at verse 25, 5:25. If a person who lives by the Spirit, who walks by the Spirit, that's a spiritual person. It's interesting, you can go in most word studies and you can see how the word spiritual is used. It's not used in the Old Testament. It's not even used in the life of Christ. It's primarily Acts and the epistles. But it's an interesting word study. But contextually, it would have to be people that are, we would say, are maturing. They're developing the fruit of the Spirit. And here's a person who is not, or has been overtaken. And then a part of what a person who is spiritual in trying to restore such a one A part of what he's doing is in verse 2, which is what? Bear ye one another's burdens, and so fulfill the law of Christ. Let's just read those first 5 verses. David, if you would, please read for us. Galatians 6, 1 through 5.
Brethren, if a man is overtaken in any trespass, you who are spiritual, restore such a one in a spirit of gentleness, considering yourself, lest you also be tempted. Bear one another's burdens, and so fulfill the law of Christ. For if anyone thinks himself to be something when he is nothing, he deceives himself. But let each one examine his own work, and then he will have rejoicing in himself alone, and not in another. For each one shall bear his own load.
Yeah, sometimes people will get caught up on that one. We're to bear one another's burdens in verse 2, but then in verse 5, each man shall bear his own burden. Maybe we'll come back to that in a moment. But let's keep going. 6 through 10, Patty, if you would.
Let him who is taught the word share in all good things with him who teaches. Do not be deceived, God is not mocked. For whatever a man sows, that he will also reap. For he who sows to his flesh will of the flesh reap corruption. But he who sows to the Spirit will of the Spirit reap everlasting life. And let us not grow weary while doing good, for in due season we shall reap if we do not lose heart. Therefore, as we have opportunity, let us do good to all, especially to those who are of the household of faith.
All right, several things. We've already mentioned a couple in verse 1. Restore such a one who's overtaken in a spirit of gentleness or meekness. And while we try to help somebody else out, what do we constantly need to do? The latter part of the verse. Yeah, look at ourselves, that we not be guilty of perhaps the same thing that we are condemning in somebody else. We look to ourselves lest we also be tempted. Now, I think there is likely a relational verse to that in verse 3. Here's a person who has developed the fruit of the Spirit. He's doing pretty well. He may be more spiritually mature, and he sees somebody who's not doing what's right. He's been overtaken in a trespass. And so instead of restoring him in the spirit of gentleness, he comes down pretty caustically, harshly at a person like that. Well, if I can do it, you can too. You ought to know better than that. How long does it take for you to mature to the place where you're not going to... I can hear a lot of that. So, verse 3, if a man thinks himself to be something, like I just described, when he is nothing, what happens? He deceives himself.
That's sort of like a Pharisee.
Yes, exactly right, David. In fact, some of the sources I read after this mentioned that very thing. Like in Luke 18, I thank thee that I'm not as other men, extortioners, unjust, murderers, adulterers, or even as this publican over here. Yeah, exactly. Sometimes people will misuse passages, and they'll take, well, who are you to condemn somebody else? Don't you have your own sins? Well, yes, but if that were the case, would anybody ever be corrected of anything? No. It's the fact that we don't want to be condemning something in someone, and we're doing the same thing at the same time. Paul dealt with that among the Jews in Romans, the 2nd chapter. And you're a corrector of babes and so on, but you practice the same thing that you're condemning in them. And so he says, bear you one another's burdens, and so fulfill the law of Christ. And I think, again, contextually, he's likely dealing with, not limited to, but I think primarily he's dealing with a fellow who has been overtaken in some fault. There are two different Greek words, and sometimes it depends on who you read after. The word burden here in verse 2 is a different word from the word burden down in verse 5. Each man shall bear his own burden. And some of your translations will have, like the American Standard has a footnote on that one, a load. One gives the idea of maybe heavy, which is the first one in verse 2, bear ye one another's burdens, which some give it the idea that the greatest load that we can, a burden that we can have on us is what Jesus said, come unto me all ye that labor and are heavy laden. The laden down with what? Sin, yeah. And that's the heaviest load. And then for each man shall bear his own burden. There's a lighter among some. But there's some things that we can help bear. Some things that we can help people to try to overcome. And yet there are some things that only we can bear our own burdens. Can you think of some things offhand that nobody can bear your own burden except you? What are some things that we do that only you can do for yourself? What's that? Yes, that's one. Nobody can repent for you. Related to that, nobody can be baptized for you. Nobody can obey the gospel for you. You have to do that yourself. At the end of life, we go into Hades. When the end of time comes, we stand before God in judgment. Nobody can stand before God in judgment for you or for me. The idea of being accountable. Nobody can do the work of a husband for me except me. A father or a son. Nobody can do. There are just a lot. You can just go down the line, make a laundry list of things that nobody can do in your particular situation except you. Every man shall bear his own burdens, responsibilities that are ours and only ours. However, on the other, in verse 2, bear ye one another's burdens and so fulfill the law of Christ. If you let it contextually kind of explain itself, then the heavy burden of sin, of being overtaken in a trespass, then that would be foremost, wouldn't it? And then other things that would come, whether it be perhaps financial difficulties, emotional difficulties, setbacks in the job situation. You could go down the list where people could help you with those matters. Bear ye one another's burdens. And when you do, it's interesting, he says, and so fulfill the what? The law of Christ. Is that the only law that's in the law of Christ? To bear one another's burden? No, but it's one of those summary type statements. When Jesus said, when he was asked which is the greatest commandment, he answered, love the Lord your God with what? All your heart, soul, strength, and mind. And the second is likened to it, thou shalt love thy neighbor as thyself. On these two commandments hang all the law and the prophets. It's not that there was nothing specific except love, but love is the guiding principle, the motivating force that causes all the other things to occur. And so here we have a brother or sister in congregations there in Galatia, southern Galatia, those cities. And here's one overtaken in maybe gambling or witchcraft, sorcery. That's one of the works of the flesh. Another's been married and he's been playing around with somebody else's wife and adultery. And so here's a fella who's trying to abstain from those things, and he's trying to develop love and joy and peace and long-suffering, gentleness and kindness and goodness, self-control. All these things he's trying to develop on his own. And so what's his responsibility to try to do with those people? That's not a curveball question. Here you've got people in the congregation, I'll just wait on the elders to deal with that.
No, you do it yourself.
You do it yourself. We talked a little bit the other day in a little different context about taking ownership of corporations, ownership of teams, ownership of whatever sphere of activity I'm doing. That I am treating this work as if I'm the only one that I own the business. I'm doing. If it doesn't get, if I don't do it, it's not going to get done. Have that attitude. Now, can other people, the elders in place, all those other things help? Yes. But this is not addressed to elders or preachers or deacons or Bible class teachers. This is, brethren, if any man be overtaken in any trespass, ye who are spiritual. Yeah, restore such a one.
Brother Philip, it just, every time I've read that, for whatever reason, verse 3 just seems to be a standalone verse. Just kind of.
It is if you don't look backward at what he's just said. Yeah. But you're right, it can be applied as a standalone from other passages. I shouldn't have interrupted you. Go ahead. I interrupted you. Good and proper.
So
Sorry.
I don't have anything more to say about that other than, to me, it just says, you know, if you're put in the position, I think we might have mentioned this the other day, if you say something to somebody, even though, you know, you think, well, I think I've got the solution to this, you need to go to the person in a certain humble tone and say, look, I had the same problem myself.
Yeah.
And this is what I know that I need to do, and I'm telling you out of love that you're making a mistake, and this is what you need to do now. Just kind of talking off the ledge a little bit.
Yes.
I guess that's what that means.
Yeah, I think that's a great application of it. I do. And I for a long time, Josh, I thought the same thing you did. How does this passage in verse 3 fit with 1 and 2 and then 4? How does it fit? How does it fit the context? And I think that contextually that he's still talking about two groups of people. One group are people who've been overtaken in a trespass. The other are the ones who are trying to restore. And so as you restore, you're bearing their burdens, but you don't think that you're something when you're nothing and you deceive yourself. That is, you're not looking to yourself lest you also be tempted. That last part of verse 1. That bear you one, restore such a one in the spirit of gentleness, considering thyself lest thou also be tempted. If we don't consider ourselves, well, I'm above that, and that's not my problem. Then verse 3, if a man thinks himself to be something, well, and it's not going to touch me. When he's nothing, he deceives himself. So I think the connection, Josh, and it's a good question. The connection goes back that even if we're spiritually minded, we need to always be considering ourselves, lest we be tempted to do the same.
We got to do everything we do out of love. Right?
Yes, that's right. That's exactly right.
Good intentions are, it may or may not, have the result you want.
Right.
You got to do it out of love. You got to do it out of consideration.
Yes.
For the betterment of the person.
That's exactly right. Yes, sir, Brother David.
But I also read this, that if someone thinks he is something or has an arrogance
Yeah.
about himself, it kind of goes back to verse 1. If I am arrogant, I cannot restore brotherly gentleness.
That's right. That's right. The two don't go together. That's exactly right. Good.
You think you're too good to.
I'm sorry, what was that,
You
David?
think you're arrogant, you think you're too good to.
Yeah.
To talk to that brother.
Exactly. Yeah, that's exactly right. Yes, sir. Well, our time has passed. And thank you, guys. We'll have to stop at this.